It's time to start Wall Hobby's Lento cowl. You need your A and your B yarn, and if you have followed the instructions for the provisional cast on, your needle looks something like this. You have your stitches in waste yarn, a multiple of 12, and each 12 stitches there is a stitch marker in your work. You also need one separate stitch marker to use as a beginning of round marker. We will put that in once we have knitted the first row of stitches. So round 1 of day 1 is knit all stitches in your A yarn, and that is exactly what you are going to do. You take your A yarn and you knit all the waste yarn cast on stitches. Now, I am a continental knitter, but of course, if it's your preferred method, you can also use the English way of holding your needles and yarn. And every time when you approach a stitch marker, all you do is just slip it from the left needle to the right needle. If you don't like to use stitch markers, and if you are a somewhat more experienced knitter, you don't have to put them in, of course. Once you have knitted all your stitches, it is time to close in the rounds. You just need to sit down and be very careful not to put a twist in your work. I like to sit down at a table, put my work in front of me, and then I put all the waste yarn on the inside of the needle and all the stitches on the outside of the needle. Also the stitch markers, I turn them to the outside of the needle so I can make sure that my work is not twisted anywhere. Now, as you can see, I have all the waste yarn on the inside and the stitches in my color A yarn and the stitch markers on the outside. If there would be a twist in your work, you would actually end up with a Mobius kind, like knitting. You wouldn't notice it in the first round, maybe not even in the second, but in the end you will see that your work is not knitted up in a straight, nice tube. It will have a twist somewhere. In the first or the second round you could just fiddle it a little and turn it back. But once you are further along in your work, there's no other option than to just rip it out and start over. So make sure that you take your time to start working in the round at a point that you don't need to go anywhere. You can just sit down and take your time to make sure all will be all right. It's now time to put in your beginning of round marker. You just slip it on the right hand needle and just let it hang there, so that once you worked all your stitches and you are coming across the beginning of round marker, you know it's time to start your next round of knitting. I'm sure there's no twist in my work, so I'm picking it up carefully. And I'm going to work my day 1 row 2, which is purl the entire round in your A color yarn. The first rounds are always a bit fiddly. You can just leave your waste yarn ends and your beginning of your color A yarn, just let it hang. The waste yarn will be taken out in the end and the A color yarn will be woven in. So we will take care of that later. Just purl your entire round of stitches. And just slip the markers as you come across them. Once you have reached your beginning of round marker, just slip it to the right hand needle and then you start your day 1 round 3, which is knit all stitches again. I will just skip the round of knit stitches because you all know how to do that, and I'm going to skip ahead to round 4, where color B will be introduced. I'm sorry for pointing out to the Dutch side of the pattern. I'm just voice-overing this clip, so I didn't make a new clip. So your B yarn, you just add it, you just start knitting it. And you don't cut your A yarn, just let it hang there, it won't go anywhere. And knit the entire round with your color B. Once you have reached the beginning of round marker, it's time to start alternating the colors. Make sure that you don't use your tail end of your color A. Use the end that comes from the skein. You just start knitting, knit 1 stitch in A, and then purl 2 stitches in B. Make sure you will bring your B yarn to the back of your work again before knitting the next color A stitch. Be careful that you do stretch out the stitches on the right hand needle a little. If you are working really close to the tips of your needle and you pull your yarn really tight, you will end up with puckering in your work, and that would be a shame. So make sure that even if there's a float in another color behind 2 or more stitches, to stretch them out a little, so your knitting will be balanced and even all the way through. It's up to you how you manage your strands of yarn. You can knit with one color in one hand and the other color in the other hand. So you pick one yarn and you throw the other yarn. But you can also choose to put both strands of yarn over your left hand, like I prefer to do. I put one strand of yarn just over my index finger and the other strand over my index finger and my middle finger. And that way, when I'm knitting, I can just pick the yarn that I need for that stitch. There is a lot to do about yarn dominance in colorwork knitting, but because I want this to be a beginner-friendly project, I have decided not to concentrate on that too much. I would advise you to knit the entire round the way you started it. So if you start the round with your B color yarn on the left and your A color yarn on the right, I would advise you to keep it that way for the entire round. Now let's assume that you have knitted all 5 rounds and your needle has all these knit 1A, purl 2B stitches for the entire round. You don't want to lose this work, and if you are a less experienced knitter and you are worried about making a mistake later on, each day at the end of the 5 rounds would be a good time to put in a lifeline. I am using dental floss as a lifeline. You can use any smooth yarn, you can use cotton or just a sewing thread, or well, whatever is smooth and not too heavy. Just thread it in your needle And now you are going to thread it through all the stitches that you have on the needle. I don't thread the stitch markers. If you have stitch markers that you can open, it wouldn't be a big problem, but my beginning of round marker can't be opened, so I definitely don't want to thread the lifeline through there. So I'm skipping the markers and I just put in the dental floss on all the stitches all the way around. This way, when you make a mistake later on, you can take your needle out, rip your work, and the stitches that you threaded on a lifeline will be saved, and they are easy to pick up and just start the row or the rows again. Once you have threaded your lifeline through all the stitches, you are ready for tomorrow's pattern.